Okay, imagine this. Nearly 860 million people.
Hmm.
That's like more than the whole population of Europe.
Yeah.
And they're living in a country where their religion isn't the majority one.
It's a huge number. It really puts things in perspective.
Yeah, and this global movement, it's creating what researchers call religious diasporas. It's genuinely reshaping the religious map, not just for the people moving, but for everyone, really.
Absolutely. What's really striking is just the scale of it and the complexity. We're not just talking about a few groups moving here and there. It feels like entire religious landscapes are being, well, redrawn.
Right, so in this deep dive, we want to explore the patterns, behind these shifts, the impacts they're having, and maybe what it all means for the future.
Exactly. Where is this heading?
And to get a proper handle on this huge phenomenon, we've really immersed ourselves in some fascinating research, looking at global religious demographics, migration trends.
Yeah, we're drawing heavily on data from sources like the World Christian Database, or WCD, and the World Religion Database, the WRD.
Think of them like, well, incredibly detailed global maps of who believes what and where.
Mm-hmm. And what's really insightful, I think, is their method. They don't just count, say, Christians and Muslims globally. They dig deeper, looking at the combination of ethnicity and language to understand how distinct peoples are moving.
That ethno-linguistic angle, that seems crucial.
It is. It gives you a much more granular picture. You can see how specific cultural communities maintain their identity across borders. Much better than just looking at broad religious labels.
So why should you, our listener, care about all this?
Yeah.
Well, understanding these massive shifts gives you a really powerful way to look at global dynamics, right? Cultural interactions, how societies are changing. It's all connected.
Definitely. We promise to bring you the key takeaways, some pretty surprising facts, too, without, drowning you in spreadsheets.
Yeah, we'll keep it focused.
And if you think about your own experience, maybe in your city or town, you might be seeing more diversity, different faiths, different cultures. Understanding these diaspora trends helps make sense of that, gives it a broader context. It's not just local, it's part of this global story.
Right. So our mission today is pretty clear. Understand the scale, the sheer size of these religious diasporas. Figure out the key countries who's hosting these populations and where are they coming from. And really get to the heart of what it means for religious diversity and, how we all interact globally.
Precisely. We're trying to paint a clearer picture of this complex situation using the best data available to see the main trends and what they might imply long term for religion, for society.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What exactly is a religious diaspora? How do we define that?
Okay, so at its core, a religious diaspora is basically a group of people belonging to a particular religion who are living outside their traditional or historical homeland because of migration.
Simple enough.
Yeah, but it plays out in different ways. Sometimes migration introduces a religion that's completely new to an area. Other times it brings maybe new branches or different ways of practicing a religion that's already there.
We've seen that happen a lot throughout history, haven't we? Like Buddhism spreading across Asia or Christianity moving into different parts of the world.
Exactly. History is full of examples, and the sources we looked at, they really highlight the recent growth spurts in some diasporas. Think about the growing Muslim communities in parts of Western Europe over the last few decades. That's a very visible example.
And that naturally feeds into greater religious diversity in those host countries.
It does. It contributes significantly to that mix.
Yeah, you definitely see that in big cities. A real spectrum of faiths. So how on earth do researchers even start to measure something this big and, well, fluid? Quantifying global diasporas sounds tricky.
It is tricky. It's where, demography, the science of populations, meets the study of religion. To quantify this properly, the research points to needing a few key things. First, a systematic way to categorize all the world's peoples, usually based on shared ethnicity, language.
The ethno-linguistic groups again.
Right. Second, you need a clear, consistent way to classify religions, a taxonomy of faiths. And third, you need solid ways to collect and analyze data on both peoples and their religious affiliations.
And that's where these big databases, the WCD and WRT, come into play. They provide that structure and data.
Exactly. They're built on these kinds of classification systems and huge data collection efforts. They try to give a really comprehensive view, and their initial big finding, as we mentioned, is that figure, 859 million people from 327 distinct peoples living in diasporas. That's about 12.5% of everyone on the planet.
Wow. 12.5%. It's just a massive slice of humanity.
It really is.
And this isn't just a one-off snapshot, right? This analysis considers things changing over time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It has to. It looks at births, deaths, conversions, people changing faiths, and, crucially, immigration and emigration. The movement of people.
So it's dynamic. It's tracking ongoing shifts.
It's a constantly evolving picture, yes, reflecting what's actually happening within these communities.
Now, something that feels really fundamental to any discussion about religious identity is freedom of religion, isn't it?
Absolutely essential. You really can't talk about religious demographics accurately without acknowledging that principle. The UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18 specifically, that's the cornerstone. Freedom of thought, conscience, religion, including the freedom to change your religion or belief.
And that idea, it's not just some abstract legal thing. It's actually built into many national constitutions, right?
I know.
And it influences how data gets collected.
It does. It often shapes census questions, for example. There's an emphasis on self-identification. What religion do you say you belong to?
So taking people's public declarations of faith seriously is key.
It has to be the starting point for this kind of demographic work, respecting how people identify themselves.
Okay, so we need lots of data. Where does it all come from? Who's collecting this information on religious affiliation?
Good question. It primarily flows from two main channels. First, you've got records kept by the religious communities themselves, churches, mosques, temples, etc. And second, there are the official government censuses that many countries conduct.
I can imagine some religious groups are pretty meticulous about membership records.
Some are incredibly detailed. The research we looked at highlights Christian denominations, for example, something like 41,000 of them globally. They collectively spend, get this, over $1 billion a year gathering and analyzing their own membership data.
$1 billion
Yeah.
annually. That's astonishing. What does that tell us?
It tells us how important tracking their own communities is to these religious groups. For planning, for resource allocation, for understanding their own growth or decline. It's a massive internal data operation, even if it's decentralized.
Wow. Okay. And then there are the government censuses, covering everyone, not just members of one faith.
Exactly. National censuses provide that broader context. They often ask about religion, but also language, country of origin, ethnicity, lots of useful demographic data points.
Which allows researchers to see how religion intersects with other identities.
Precisely.
But I'm guessing these two sources, the internal religious records and the government censuses, they don't always perfectly match up, do they?
That's a really important point. No, they often don't align perfectly. The research gives the example of Egypt. Government census figures there show a significantly lower percentage of Christians than what estimates from Christian church sources suggest.
Why would that happen?
Oh, various reasons. It could be social or political pressures affecting how people answer census questions, maybe different definitions being used, or just different methodologies in counting.
So you really need both kinds of data to get a fuller picture.
Definitely. You have to triangulate, compare the sources, understand the potential biases in each to get closer to the reality on the ground.
Okay, so to really dig into these diasporas, you need these classification systems, these taxonomies. One for religions, one for peoples. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. The WCD and WRD use a standard set of 18 major religious categories. Things like Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, but also agnosticism, atheism, traditional ethnic religions, and so on. This allows for consistent coding across the globe. So you can take a group, say Mandarin-speaking Han Chinese, and estimate the breakdown. How many might identify as Buddhist, Christian, non-religious, folk religion adherents, etc.
So it goes beyond just the big labels. It allows for nuance within those broad categories.
Exactly. And then for peoples, the taxonomy gets even more fine-grained. As we said, it combines ethnicity and primary language, creating these ethno-linguistic peoples. The research identifies something like 12,600 distinct groups worldwide using this method.
12,600, that's incredibly detailed. So if you have people of the same ethnicity but different mother tongues, they'd be counted as separate groups.
That's right. The example given is ethnic Kazakhs. Some primarily speak Kazakh. Others might speak Russian as their mother tongue due to historical factors. They'd be treated as distinct ethno-linguistic groups in this system.
Okay, and then you figure out the religious makeup of each of those 12,600 groups.
Essentially, yes. You cross-reference the people's data with the religious affiliation data, drawing from both the religious community sources and the government censuses we talked about. It's a complex data synthesis process.
Right, so you've got the data, you've got the categories. How do researchers then actually pinpoint who is in diaspora and analyze them globally.
They use a pretty systematic three-step method according to the source material. First, they take their huge database of all identified peoples and sort it. Second, they apply a filter. They look for peoples who have a presence, even a small one, in more than 3 countries. This helps focus on groups with some level of international dispersion.
Okay, more than 3 countries.
Then third, for each of those dispersed peoples, they identify the country with the single largest population of that group. That's designated the home country. Everyone else belonging to that specific ethno-linguistic group, living in any other country, is then counted as being part of the diaspora for that people.
Ah, I see. So it's defined by being outside the largest single concentration.
Correct. And that rigorous process is what leads back to that headline statistic. 859 million people from 327 distinct peoples, making up 12.5% of the world's population, are living in diaspora by this definition.
Got it. And what about the religious breakdown of those 859 million people?
Well, as we touched on, Christians make up the biggest slice, about 47.4% of the total diaspora population. Muslims are the next largest group at around 25.4%.
Which is interesting because you mentioned Christians and Muslims together are about 55% of the world's population, but they make up almost 3/4, nearly 73% of the diaspora population.
That's a key finding, yeah. It suggests that adherents of these 2 largest global religions are disproportionately represented among those living outside their home countries.
Why might that be?
It likely reflects a combination of things. Historical factors like colonial expansion and missionary movements for sure, but also more recent patterns of global migration, economic migration, refugees seeking asylum. These flows have often heavily involved people from Christian and Muslim majority regions.
Makes sense. The source also notes something interesting about proportions. Christianity has the highest proportion of its own global followers living in diaspora. Among the major world religions, about 18%.
Yes, nearly 1 in 5 Christians globally live outside their designated home country based on this ethno-linguistic approach.
But some smaller religions have even higher proportions of their followers in diaspora, like Taoists, Jews, Baha'is.
That's right. For some of these smaller global faiths, the percentage of their adherents living in diaspora is significantly higher. Taoists, Jews, Spiritists, Baha'is, Zoroastrians, they all show higher proportions than Christians.
What drives that for smaller groups?
Often, it connects back to their specific histories. Maybe periods of persecution or displacement, forced migration, or perhaps a strong tradition of seeking opportunities, educational or economic, abroad. And of course, with smaller total numbers globally, even a modest number of migrants represents a larger percentage of their total population living in diaspora.
Okay, that clarifies things. So let's talk geography. Which countries are the main destinations? Where are these diaspora populations landing?
The data points very clearly to 2 giants, the United States and India. Together, they host nearly half, almost 50% of the entire global religious diaspora population.
Half. Just between those 2.
Pretty much. And other research, like the Pew study mentioned in our source material, confirms the U.S. as a top destination for migrants overall, and especially for Christians, but also notably for Buddhists, agnostics, and atheists moving internationally.
That fits the narrative of the U.S. as a nation of immigrants, and India's own complex history of internal and regional migration and its own diversity. What about other major host countries?
Well, the research includes a Table 2, listing other significant hosts. Countries like Colombia, Venezuela, interestingly North Korea, Taiwan, Mexico, Pakistan, Chile, Afghanistan. They all have pretty substantial percentages of their populations classified as being part of religious diasporas.
The reasons must vary hugely between those places.
Oh, absolutely. Regional migration, specific refugee situations, political history, economic draws. It's a unique story for each.
Okay, flip side of the coin.
Yeah.
Which countries are the main sending countries? Where are people primarily migrating from to become part of these diasporas?
Mexico leads that list, according to the data, Table 3, followed by Bangladesh, Argentina, China, India, South Korea, Russia, Pakistan. The United States actually appears as a sending country, too, and Syria.
Interesting that India and Pakistan in the U.S. are on both lists, major hosts and major senders.
It highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Migration isn't just a one-way street. Countries can be sources of emigration and destinations for immigration simultaneously.
And Bangladesh.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting case highlighted, a major sender for both Hindus and Muslims.
Yes, specifically Bengali people. Many Hindu Bengalis migrate to India, often due to historical and cultural ties or perceived better opportunities, while many Muslim Bengalis also migrate, often to India, but also to the Middle East and elsewhere, largely for economic reasons. It's a major source of diaspora for both groups.
The research also flags something called the mestizo problem related to sending countries. What's that about?
Yes. That's basically a data limitation acknowledged by the researchers. In Latin America, people of mixed European and indigenous ancestry mestizos are often categorized as a single large people group in this kind of analysis. Since Mexico has the largest mestizo population, it gets designated the home country. This means mestizos living in other Latin American countries technically get counted as diaspora.
Even if they've lived in, say, Colombia or Peru for generations.
Exactly. It potentially oversimplifies the very real and distinct national and cultural identities within mestizo populations across the continent. It's a known methodological challenge when working with these broad categories.
Got it. A necessary simplification for the model, but with limitations. Okay, let's zoom in on the peoples themselves again. Which ethno-linguistic groups are spread across the most countries, the most geographically dispersed?
Right. If you rank them by the sheer number of countries they have a diaspora presence in, Table 4, you see groups like English speakers, French speakers, USA whites, Mandarin-speaking, Han Chinese, and Germans near the top.
That makes a lot of sense historically, doesn't it? Colonial languages, global economic reach.
Precisely. It reflects those historical empires, global business connections, but also, more recently, refugee flows and labor migration patterns that have spread these groups widely. Think Syrian Arabs or Greeks are also high on that list.
Okay, but what about ranking by the percentage of a group's total population that lives outside the home country? That might show different groups rising to the top.
It does, significantly different. When you rank by the proportion in diaspora, Table 5, you find groups like Assyrian Christians, low German speakers, like Mennonites perhaps, colored populations from southern Africa, Syrian Aramaic speakers, Kuwaiti Arabs.
Smaller groups.
Often smaller, overall, yes. Or groups with histories of significant displacement or migration waves. Assyrian Christians, for example, have faced persecution in their Middle Eastern homelands, leading to a large percentage living abroad. Kuwaiti Arabs might reflect patterns of seeking education or business opportunities internationally relative to their smaller home population. Jewish people speaking Yiddish are also high on this list, reflecting historical scattering.
So different ways of measuring diaspora review different aspects of the phenomenon.
Exactly. Number of countries shows breadth of spread. Percentage in diaspora shows the intensity of the migration experience relative to the group's size.
Now let's link this back to the major religions. For the big ones, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, which specific ethno-linguistic groups make up their largest diaspora populations.
Okay, the research breaks this down. Table 6. For Christians, some of the largest diaspora groups are Latin American mestizos and whites, due to that mestizo problem effect, but also Russians, Germans, Italians, Filipinos, Syrian Arabs, reflecting various migration histories.
A real mix. What about Muslims?
For Muslims, the biggest diaspora groups include Bengalis from Bangladesh and India, Urdu speakers, often linked to Pakistan and India, Pashtuns from Afghanistan and to Pakistan, Malays, Syrian Arabs again, Hausa from West Africa, Tajiks, Somalis, Kurds, Palestinian Arabs. Again, diverse origins, many linked to economic migration or refugee situations.
No, Hindus.
Predominantly South Asian groups, Bengalis again, Tamils, Hindi speakers, Nepalese, Sindhis, Gujaratis, Punjabis, Telugu speakers, Malayalis, reflecting migration mainly from the Indian subcontinent.
And Buddhists.
Primarily East and Southeast Asian groups, various Han Chinese language groups, Minnan, Yu, Cantonese, Mandarin are very large. Also Japanese, Vietnamese, Koreans, Khmer, Cambodians, Burmese, Thai, Sinhalese from Sri Lanka.
It's really striking how many of the largest diaspora groups for each religion originate from what you might consider the religion's traditional or historical heartlands.
That's a very important observation, yes. It shows how migration, driven by all sorts of modern pressures and opportunities, is scattering populations from these core areas across the globe, diversifying where these faiths are practiced.
And the Pew study mentioned specifically highlighted Jewish people having the highest rate of international migration.
Yes, about 25%, a quarter, of people identifying as Jewish were born in a different country than the one they currently live in. That's the highest percentage among major religious groups studied. And a major flow, historically and recently, has been migration, particularly from Europe and the former Soviet Union towards the Middle East, specifically Israel.
So migration is clearly a massive engine of religious change globally. How does it fit alongside the other factors that change religious populations?
Well, the sources typically point to three main drivers, illustrated in Figure 1. First, natural increase, simply births minus deaths within the group. Second, conversion, people switching in minus people switching out. And third, migration, immigration minus emigration.
And which one usually has the biggest impact?
Globally, for most large religious groups, it's still natural increase birth minus deaths. That's the primary engine of population change. More babies being born than people dying within the group leads to growth.
And conversion trends, they've shifted over time.
They have. The 20th century saw big shifts, lots of movement from smaller ethnic religions into the major world religions. Also, particularly in the West, a significant move away from Christianity towards being non-religious or unaffiliated. But the research suggests these trends might have slowed down a bit in the 21st century. There's even talk of a global resurgence of religion, with the growth rate of atheists and agnostics slowing relative to religious populations.
Interesting. And the impact of migration seems to really vary depending on where you look.
Hugely. It can be a major factor in specific regions. Like in the U.S., immigration, particularly from Asia, means Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism are growing faster proportionally than Christianity or the unaffiliated population.
And in Europe?
In Europe, immigration, especially of Muslim populations from North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, has really changed the religious makeup of many countries. And that's become, as you know, a major social and political issue in many places.
And sometimes migration leads to a decrease in a religion's presence.
Yes, the example given is Central Asia after the Soviet Union collapsed. Many people of European descent, who were often Christian, emigrated, leading to a decline in the Christian percentage in those countries.
And the reasons people migrate, it's complex, not just one thing.
Rarely just one thing. The research talks about push factors, things driving people away, like poverty, war, persecution, and pull factors, things attracting them, like jobs, family, freedom, safety. But the lines get blurred. Is a Syrian Orthodox Christian leaving Syria primarily an economic migrant seeking work, or a refugee fleeing instability and potential discrimination? Often, it's a mix. It's hard to neatly label.
So the overall trend seems to be that ongoing migration is pushing the world towards being more religiously mixed, more pluralistic.
That seems to be a key takeaway, yes. The prediction mentioned is that by 2100, finding countries where one single world religion accounts for 90% or more of the population might become quite rare. Migration is scrambling the old maps.
And this increasing religious diversity, it shows up in different ways.
It does. You can talk about intra-religious diversity, like different denominations within Christianity. But our focus here, driven by migration, is mostly on interreligious diversity, the mix of completely different faiths in one place.
And it's not always evenly spread within a country.
No, definitely not. Diversity tends to cluster. You often see much higher levels of religious diversity in big cities, especially major hubs that attract immigrants and refugees compared to more rural, homogeneous areas.
The research used a specific measure, the Religious Diversity Index, or RDI. What did that show?
Right. The RDI tries to put a number on diversity, from no diversity to 1, maximum diversity. Looking at trends from 1910 to 2010, Table 7, the general picture is increasing diversity. Most regions saw their average country RDI go up, and the overall regional RDI went up too.
Which regions saw the biggest jumps in diversity?
The most significant increases were in places like Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Eastern Asia, and Northern America, and the main driver identified for this increase, migration.
But Asia remained the most diverse continent overall.
Yes. Throughout that century, Asia consistently scored highest on religious diversity. Even though the composition changed, like declines in Chinese folk religion and Buddhism adherence relative to gains by Muslims, Christians, and the non-religious, the overall mix remained highly diverse.
Why is Asia so diverse, traditionally?
That's a deep question. Partly, it's just the sheer scale and variety of cultures and histories packed into the continent. Many Asian cultures also have a history of religious pluralism or syncretism, allowing different traditions to coexist or blend more easily than in some other regions. Plus, there's significant migration within Asia, too. Think of Indian and Filipino workers moving to the Gulf states, or Indonesian women working abroad. That adds to the mix.
And in the global North, Europe, North America, The increasing diversity is driven by both migration and secularization.
Seems to be a dual effect, yes. Immigration brings new faiths, while secularization means the historically dominant religion, usually Christianity, represents a smaller share of the population, making space for other groups and the non-affiliated to become more visible proportionally.
Is there another way to look at diversity besides the index?
Yeah, another simple way is just to count how many different religions make up a significant chunk, say, over 1% or 5% of a country's population. By that measure, too, countries in East and Southeast Asia, like Vietnam or South Korea, often show very high diversity, with several distinct religious traditions having a substantial presence.
Okay, so how do these really big forces like globalization and secularization play into all this? How do they connect with diasporas and diversity?
Well, globalization, almost by definition, makes all this happen faster and more easily. The movement of people, ideas, money, culture across borders, it's the engine driving much of this migration and the resulting diversity. It makes it much harder for any single religion to maintain a complete monopoly in a globalized world. People are exposed to alternatives, and they can move more easily.
So globalization fuels diversity and maybe offers more religious choice.
That's often seen as a positive outcome in pluralistic societies, yes. More options, more freedom to choose or change one's beliefs.
Now, what about secularization? There's this long-held idea, wasn't there, that as societies modernize, get more scientific, religion would just fade away.
That was definitely a dominant theory in sociology for much of the 20th century, the secularization thesis. Reason and science would replace faith. But it's proven more complicated. It's important to separate institutional secularization, like the declining political power of churches, from individual secularization, like whether people personally stop believing or practicing.
And the evidence for widespread individual decline isn't that clear-cut.
It's mixed, especially globally. While church attendance has dropped in parts of Europe, personal belief often remains quite high. And outside the West, the picture is often one of religious vitality, not decline.
In fact, you mentioned the research points to a global resurgence of religion since maybe the 1970s.
Yes. The data suggests the proportion of the world identifying as non-religious actually peaked around 1970 and has slightly decreased since then. Growth rates for most major religions have outpaced the growth of the non-religious population globally. Think about the revival of religion in places like Russia and Eastern Europe after communism fell. That fits this pattern too.
So the idea that globalization and diversity automatically kill off religion, the data doesn't really support that.
It seems not. The data suggests religion is proving remarkably resilient, even adaptive, in the face of globalization and increasing pluralism. Religious resurgence seems likely to continue alongside these trends. It challenges that old secularization assumption.
These are really profound changes we're talking about. What are the implications, especially for how different religious groups interact? The research focused a bit on Christian engagement, right?
It did, but the implications are broader, really, touching on how we build civil societies in diverse contexts. The core point is that increased religious diversity, driven by diasporas, means people of different faiths are living side by side much more than in the past. So for Christians, particularly in historically Christian countries, their neighbors, their colleagues, the people their kids go to school with, they are increasingly likely to be Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, or something else.
The mission field is no longer just over there, it's also right here.
Exactly. That language is used. It requires a shift in thinking. Engagement with other faiths becomes less about specialized overseas missions and more about everyday interactions and relationships.
But the research also pointed out a kind of disconnect there.
Yes, it highlighted some statistics suggesting that while Christians globally engage in a vast amount of evangelism, something like 85% or more of it is directed towards other Christians' different denominations or less active members. And conversely, surveys indicate that huge majorities of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists globally, maybe 86% or more, report not personally knowing a single Christian.
Wow. That suggests big gaps in mutual understanding and personal connection.
It really does. The argument made is that building bridges, fostering genuine understanding and positive relationships across faith lines needs to become a more central responsibility for the whole community, not just specialists. These religious diasporas create the opportunities, the necessity, really, for this engagement right in our own towns and cities.
And a key part of that engagement has to be education, right? Learning about other faiths.
Absolutely critical. You can't engage meaningfully or compassionately without some understanding of the other person's beliefs, history, practices. You need that religious literacy.
And there was a surprising finding about that in the U.S.
Yeah, a Pew study was cited showing that Somewhat counterintuitively, American evangelical Christians scored lower on a test of basic knowledge about world religions compared to several other groups, including atheists, agnostics, Jews, and Mormons.
That really underlines the need for better education across the board, doesn't it? And not just about theology, but about the lived realities of people in diaspora.
Exactly. Understanding the global issues that often drive migration and affect diaspora communities, poverty, conflict, seeking refuge, challenges of integration, even things like modern slavery or addiction that can disproportionately affect vulnerable migrant populations. Awareness of those realities is part of compassionate engagement.
So what's the ultimate call to action then?
The research concludes by emphasizing a renewed spirit of simply hospitality and friendship, building genuine connections with people of other faiths as neighbors and fellow citizens. That's presented as key not just for, say, Christian witness, but for fostering civility and mutual respect in increasingly diverse societies.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the absolute must-remember points for our listeners?
I'd say three things stand out. First, just the immense scale of religious diasporas, 859 million people, 12.5% of the world. It's a defining feature of our time, and it's actively changing the global religious map. Second, religious diversity is increasing in most parts of the world, largely fueled by migration and globalization. Our societies are becoming more pluralistic. And third, because of this, learning about, understanding, and engaging positively with people from different religious backgrounds is no longer optional, it's becoming essential for everyone.
And for you, the listener, grappling with these trends really helps you make sense of the world. It connects the dots between global events, the changes you might see in your own community, and even your own personal interactions.
It really leads to a final thought, doesn't it? As our world gets ever more interconnected and religiously diverse, how does that change how we see each other? What new challenges does it bring? But also, what new possibilities for understanding, for cooperation, maybe even for new kinds of community might emerge from this great mixing of peoples and faiths?
A really important question to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.